Right, thank you very much. And it didn't really take much convincing to get me to Barcelona, I have to say. It's always wonderful to be here. And thank you all for coming along, of course, on a teaching day as well. And I know there's a few people who've been teaching quite a lot already today. So thank you all for coming along. What I'll be doing in this talk will basically be to take you through the key themes of my latest book, Gatewatching and News Curation. That's what it looks like. I'll take you through really what the major themes are, what the major argument of that book is, and how we got to where we are essentially with journalism and social media and the ongoing intersections between those two sides. The book, some of you may know, essentially is a sequel to a book I published in 2005, which is called Gatewatching, Collaborative Online News Curation. And really what I'd like to do actually at the start is just to start from that point and tell the story of what happened, what's happened since then. So this new book is not a new edition or a revision of the previous version, but is really the sequel to that earlier book from 2005. Because obviously, in the 13 years in between that book coming out and where we're now, a lot of things have changed. When I published that last book, Twitter didn't even exist yet. Facebook had barely moved beyond Harvard as a social network for college students. Many of the other platforms that we now use every day simply didn't exist at that point. Google even had only been around for just about 9 years or so, I think. So a lot of things have changed in the meantime, and it's, I think, important to take stock from time to time and really work out, well, how did we get here? Where are we? And where is all of this going from here? Particularly in this very complicated field of journalism, social media, and more broadly the news, which doesn't always necessarily have something to do with journalism, I guess. So I'll start from ancient history briefly, and by that, of course, I mean the 2000s, which in internet terms is a very, very long time ago now. And I'll start with this. This is actually predating the 2000s by a couple of years. This is the first independent media center, which was set up in 1998 to cover the World Trade Organization summit in Seattle. So what happened at that point was that, of course, the protesters, the people who were criticizing the World Trade Organization, were possibly quite rightly anticipating that their views and their agenda would not be covered fairly and in detail by the mainstream news in the US, and that mainly news coverage would focus on riots, would focus on protests, but wouldn't necessarily focus on the arguments that these people were making. So what they thought they might do, and you see this there from the slogan, if I can point to it there, don't hate the media, be the media. What they thought they might do with this wonderful new technology of the internet, of the web, was to set up their own news sites, set up their own independent media center, and this really became the start of a movement that at its height, I think, generated about 400 plus indie media centers around the world. I'm pretty sure there was one in Barcelona as well, and certainly in most major cities around the world there was an independent media center at some point. So essentially this was a way to do their own alternative journalism, their own citizen journalism, if you like, writing stories, writing articles, publishing photos, experimenting with some audio and video streaming at the time, bypassing the mainstream media to do their own coverage, essentially. So this was really the first emergence of what we then called citizen journalism, and a first disruption of the conventional news process, of the conventional journalism process, by internet users, by self-selecting internet users creating their own sites. And this was met with a great deal of enthusiasm by some scholars early on. Jay Rosen wrote about the people formerly known as the audience, so the audience really taking things into their own hands. Douglas Rushkoff called this a leap to authorship, so people were becoming authors, not just readers of the news. J.D. Laziker spoke of random acts of journalism. You've probably seen a number of these phrases around for the best part of 20 years now, but that essentially was the sort of a demonstration of the enthusiasm that existed for this kind of stuff at the time. And importantly too, the way they operated was quite different in that these sites, these groups, were essentially publishing their articles first without a great deal of editing, without a great deal of gatekeeping, but let their audience decide whether these stories were actually worthwhile, whether they were actually important or not. So they moved from the traditional gatekeeping model, where the information is filtered first. Editing basically means a form of filtering as well. And then anything that survives that editorial filter gets published in the newspaper or gets broadcast on TV or on radio. They moved to publishing pretty much everything that came their way and then letting the audience filter through that and making their own choices about which stories they thought were important. So that's a reversal of that model of gatekeeping, essentially. And some journalists also came on board and decided that this was actually a good idea. And they said that, as a journalist, you can only be an expert in a very narrow set of fields. And in many cases, when you write a story, the readers will know more than you do, or some of the readers at least will know more than the journalist does. So in involving the readers, involving the users ultimately in the news coverage might be a good idea, might be a good move in this case as well. And so what emerged, obviously, beyond Indymedia itself, beyond that first sort of catalyst moment, if you like, of the first Indymedia Center, we saw the rise of news blogs, of citizen journalism sites, of alternative media sites under a number of different names. And that was really a first wave of enthusiasm, I guess, for people taking the news into their own hands, if you like. And there were some major successes, some major breakthrough stories. The Drudge Report, which at that point really can be described as a citizen journalism site, broke the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, for instance, or affair, for instance. It did that largely because many of the mainstream sites who had perhaps some knowledge of it or some idea that something was going on felt that it wasn't important to report, or felt that it would be a problem to report it ethically. The Drudge Report had no such compunctions and published this story, and obviously it became a very major news story and led to an impeachment attempt by Congress. So that really happened through the Drudge Report, through a citizen journalism site ultimately as well. And in some other cases as well, we saw people like Salam Pax, who you might remember, the blogger based in Baghdad during the Gulf War, live blogging essentially the bombing raids on Baghdad, and becoming a major source for the inside information from Iraq, because of course none of the mainstream Western media organizations at that point had correspondence there. So this became a major source of information during this time as well. And in fact, just to illustrate the rise of citizen journalism, this is from the Google Ngram viewer, just looking for the term citizen journalism, and you see there how much it takes off from the late 90s, from the early 2000s onwards. So we really have a massive increase in discussion of citizen journalism over the ensuing years since then. Really what we see is that this idea of citizen journalism starts to take off. And, to some extent, this is sort of a gloomy picture of journalism. This worried, of course, mainstream journalists as well. This worried news organizations because it felt as if the barbarians were at the gate. It felt as if there were now people who are not journalists, who are producing news, people who are perhaps taking away attention from the mainstream professionally produced news. This was quite a significant concern for them at first, and they thought that already in an environment where, of course, they were already struggling with digitization, with the move online, they were now increasingly concerned that this would seriously undermine the business model of journalism, the business model of professional news production. Of course, they started calling these citizen journalists parasites and people who were clearly outside of the profession and therefore not as good as professional journalists. But at the same time, we also had voices that were critical of mainstream journalism. And Jane Singer, for instance, a major long-time journalism scholar, said, well, journalists traditionally haven't actually told us much about how they come to the stories that they write. They haven't as she says there, let the public in on how the sausage is made, what journalism looks like from the inside. And so maybe that additional transparency that citizen journalism provides might be a good thing, might be an advancement. And ultimately, if nothing else, there is a balance of power that's shifting here between journalism and its publics, between journalism and its users, because suddenly those users can actually find other ways to get the news, perhaps, than only professional gatekeeping-based journalism. Having said that, though, ultimately a lot of these citizen journalism projects were also perhaps less successful than at first thought, because while it's easy, well, it's not easy, but while it's possible to cover the World Trade Organization summit over the course of a weekend or so, for people to take time off and go to Seattle and cover it in detail and do their thing, doing that on an ongoing basis over days and weeks and months and years is very, very difficult, because of course you need resources. You can't be everywhere to cover everything firsthand. So much of the journalism, much of the citizen journalism that emerged was actually not so much reporting new news stories, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal notwithstanding, but was really covering the news coverage, was really responding to mainstream news coverage. So in many ways, and this is where my term gatewatching comes in many ways what citizen journalists and news bloggers and so on did was to observe the gates of mainstream news organizations, observe what was published in the mainstream news, and then comment on that, respond to that, interpret it differently, compile it differently, put different stories maybe from different organizations together and compare how they're covering a particular issue. So in many ways, they were watching the gates of the mainstream news. They weren't engaged in their own gatekeeping. They weren't engaged in their own news production so much as they were in feeding off, and this is again where the term parasite, of course, comes in, feeding off the mainstream news and adding further information, further commentary, further compiling and curation to that content. It is simply very, very difficult for an independent citizen journalism organization to sustain itself in the long term unless it does that, unless it does this kind of secondary work. It's simply too difficult for them to find the resources to do a lot of first-hand reporting. And, as people said then in response, well, without the daily work of these print journalists, of professional journalists, news blogs probably wouldn't contain much news. They wouldn't actually know what to feed off. They wouldn't be able to do their work. That's not to say that they're not important in many ways as a corrective to mainstream news, but they do feed off that mainstream news coverage as well. We can't expect, as Chris Atten said, for these citizen journalism projects to provide serious competition. They can provide a corrective, but they cannot compete directly with The Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post or other major news sources in their own right. They simply don't have the network of correspondence and so on. So there were a number of different views ultimately on citizen journalism and its contribution. Clay Shirky, always very positive, always a booster for these developments, said this is the democratization of opinion on the net. I don't know that he'd still go as far now. The Washington Post columnist, New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman said the internet at its ugliest is just an open sewer, which is a very negative view, obviously. So the many professional journalists essentially felt that these people are just criticizing us all the time. They have no idea what they're talking about, but they'll voice their opinions. They'll air their opinions anyway. So this doesn't contribute anything. This is all just crap, basically. I think a more balanced view, again, is Jane Singer's, that says, well, a lot of these news blogs, a lot of these citizen journalism sites, if they survive at all, become normalized, become incorporated somehow into the journalism process. And ultimately, this is actually what happened with many of the news bloggers, the citizen journalists of the first generation. Many of them ultimately actually became columnists for major news outlets as well. Salam Pax, for instance, ended up writing a column for The Guardian. Matt Drudge, obviously, just turned the Drudge Report into a not quite professional news site, perhaps, but into something that is much more commercially oriented and really is a news publisher in a sense, in one sense or another now. And many of the other sites, Huffington Post, for instance, which at some point was also called a news blog or a citizen journalism site, perhaps. Obviously, many of these sites actually became established as news outlets in their own right. They became professionalized, commercialized, and went well beyond this initial realm. But simply also many of the news bloggers, many of the voices that emerged initially as citizen journalists and news bloggers ended up working for major news outlets, at least for a while, and were normalized into the journalistic process as well. So this is in a sense where the first wave of this citizen journalism ends. That's about the mid-2000s or so, roughly at the time perhaps that my book on Gatewatching actually came out. This was really the end of much of this sort of first wave of citizen journalism, and journalism, professional journalism, if you like, the empire struck back. The empire kind of, the profession incorporated some of these people into the professional world, and some others fell by the wayside because they just didn't have the funding to continue their work in the longer term. But then something else happened, and new modes and new models came along, and that they caused a new disruption to mainstream journalism. And it starts, well, not quite starts, but it looks something like this. I don't know if any of you recognize this image, this sketch. The caption maybe gives it away. This is the first paper sketch of what would become Twitter, what would become the Twitter interface. This is actually a photo that Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter himself, uploaded to Flickr, of a quick sketch on paper of something then still called my.stat.us, my status. But you see there, I mean, the features that you see there, you know, that's the box there for entering your content, your update, the short nature of the box. A lot of this is essentially already, a lot of the features of Twitter are already there. And then gradually, of course, this was then turned into the Twitter user interface as we knew it then, and has been updated and further developed, of course, in the ensuing years into something much more complicated and fully featured. But this is where this starts. And then we have those first few events that really boost the visibility, not just of Twitter itself, but of social media more broadly. You'll probably remember this. This is, of course, the picture of the famous picture of the plane landing on the Hudson River in New York. And this guy, Yanis Krums, just happening to be on a ferry somewhere that comes to the rescue. He takes a photo on his phone from the ferry. You see the dirty ferry windows there in the front. He takes a photo, he posts it on Twitter, and this becomes the first bit of news about this ferry actually landing on the Hudson River. So this plane actually landing on the Hudson River. So this kind of citizen reporting, this citizen bystander, citizen witnessing that's taking place there, that's really the next step. Then that's really what becomes quite prominent quite quickly when these social media platforms arrive on the scene. We have a case like this as well. This is from Twitter, so you read it from the bottom up. Sohaib Attar saying, well, there's a big bang here in Abbottabad in Pakistan. What the hell's going on? And he's saying there's helicopters above. There must be something going on at 1 a.m. that's very rare in Abbottabad. What on earth is going on? Well, the next morning he found out that he had just live tweeted the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. So this was a citizen reporter, if you like, a citizen witness reporting some unusual occurrence in Pakistan that turned out to be the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. So without knowing it even, he had just shared with the world what was going on there. And of course, then we have more mainstream users taking this on. But again, this is clearly not news reporting as such, but it is mainstream celebrities, politicians, and others bypassing the media and simply pushing out their content, of course, directly to their audiences, directly to their followers. And, again, an example of that from what I believe is the last World Cup we've had. I don't think there's been one since then. But again, people directly reporting even from the playing field on what's going on. So this is literally just after the World Cup final. So you suddenly have all of these people bypassing the mainstream media, doing their own reporting, particularly the sort of eyewitness reporting, essentially, from the scene of whatever is going on. And that, again, is a very significant challenge, of course, to the structures of the mainstream media, the activities of the mainstream media. So social media are also, of course, a form of citizen media ultimately. And again, there's been a lot of boosterism, a lot of very positive views on this. A vital source, as Stuart Allen says, for real-time citizen news, particularly, of course, during crises, when perhaps there are no journalists on the scene yet, when people are taking the reporting of these events into their own hands. Jeff Jarvis, again, very positive there, said the witnesses are taking over the news. And in this case, he said this actually in 2008, and you might remember there was a major terrorist attack on a hotel in Mumbai in India, when basically you had not just witnesses, but the hostages themselves, the people who were caught up in the hotel at the time of the attack, tweeting out what was going on, trying to alert the rescue operators and the military that was trying to take the hotel back, and basically just reporting, I hear they're in this floor and that floor, they're outside my door, and so on. So not just really witnesses, but people who are directly caught up in the event, basically reporting on what's going on. Unfortunately, also in some cases reporting in a way that the terrorists themselves could find out where they are and what's going on. So this is very much a double-edged sword in some ways. Christoph Neuberg has talked about this as a seismograph for current and surprising events, particularly with the emphasis on surprising. And in fact, the term seismograph here is quite apt as well, because we also know that the US Geological Survey has used Twitter particularly to detect earthquakes, because tweets as electronic signals on the internet travel faster than sound waves through Earth, sound waves through the ground. So in fact, the tweets arrive before the vibrations arrive at the seismographs a few tens or hundreds of kilometers away. So in many ways, the USGS is actually using this to detect earthquakes as they happen, because they can see that suddenly lots of people are saying, oh my God, what was that? Or that seemed like a big one, or whatever people might say. So they can actually pick up on some of these events that way as well. Of course, only if an earthquake actually happens in a populated zone, though. And journalists themselves and journalism scholars are very much acknowledging that Twitter in particular, but social media more broadly, have really changed the way that journalism works. Emily Bell has said there's journalism before Twitter and journalism after Twitter. Alfred Hermida talks about Twitter and social media as social awareness streams. And he talks about this as ambient news, essentially, because in many ways, when you have your social media stream running somewhere in the background, it's like ambient music. But when something happens and you suddenly see all these spikes appear, everything happening, then suddenly this comes to the foreground and alerts you that something is going on. I'm sure all of us can think of times when we found that something major had happened via our Twitter or Facebook feeds or whatever it might be, and we find out because people are reporting, people are perhaps sharing some of the news from journalists themselves, but ultimately we hear it from our social network rather than directly from news outlets. And it's important in all of this as well that this becomes, of course, a medium in which professional and citizen journalism come together as well. There are news organizations and journalists in these spaces, on Facebook, on Twitter, but also citizen journalists, but also people who are simply commenting on the news, who are simply following the news and responding to it, as well as experts, as well as politicians, as well as sports people, celebrities, and everyone else. So this is a space where all of them come together, all of them actually connect with each other and are present in the same space together. And ultimately then what becomes visible is not simply driven by what gets reported by news organizations themselves, but it becomes visible because people share on and retweet and thereby heighten the visibility, divert attention to particular updates, particular stories. So as Sharon Meraz and Zizi Papakarisi have said, and they're talking here particularly about the Arab Spring, by the way, we are all together crowdsourcing prevalent actors and their tweets to prominence. We are all helping to make certain things visible, in Twitter terms, to make certain things trend, to create trending topics by retweeting, by engaging, by responding. And that's ultimately how we all together make things visible, make news stories visible in this particular context. I wanted to show you this graph because I think this really demonstrates the full change, the importance of this change as it's happening, because this is from the Reuters Institute's digital news report from 2017, and the situation hasn't changed much. And it shows across the 36, 37 nations, I think, where they run representative surveys, it shows where people get their news from. What is the main source of news for people? And you see there with TV particularly, it's especially strong in the older generation, but it drops off precipitously with younger age groups. The youngest one is there in the dark blue. So for them, TV is not even a secondary medium anymore, it's a tertiary medium, and they get their news from somewhere entirely different. So TV is an old people's medium by now. Newspapers, radio hardly even feature anymore, printed newspapers that is, and increasingly people are getting their news from online media. And that's a massive shift, as you can see there, across the age groups. And within that, social media are also growing rapidly as a medium of importance. So 33% across these nations that they've surveyed of the 18 to 24-year-olds now use social media as their main news source. So that's a massive shift, which obviously, again, very much worries conventional news organizations, and is one of the reasons that they're all now experimenting, of course, with doing news via social media in one form or another, successfully or not. So this is a very significant generational shift that's going on here, that's unfolding as we speak, and you would be kidding yourself, and news organizations, I think, would be kidding themselves if they think that as people grow up, they'll go back to TV, they'll go back to print. Online is the medium that they'll have to come to terms with, and online is the medium that they'll have to make work in some form or other. So again, gloomy picture of a printing press. I thought I'd just throw that in because that's, again, I think still how many news organizations are feeling. The old models, the old media, the old channels don't work anymore, so they've got to find another way of doing what they're doing. They've got to find another space to go to. So when we had previously, in the first wave of citizen journalism, of citizen media, we had this very nice, neat distinction between the citizen journalists on one hand and the professional journalists on the other. And partly that was driven also by the platforms that they were operating on. Even if you're thinking just about online, you had the masthead sites, you had CNN and New York Times and Washington Post and whatever. You had these imprints that had their own websites. And of course, the people who were operating those, the journalists and the editors and so on the one side. And then you had all of these independent sites. You had independent news sites being set up. You had hosting services like blogger.com and so on. And that's where the news bloggers and the citizen journalists were. And you could quite clearly distinguish between the two of them because these were really hermetically different spaces, entirely different spaces. Now, down the track, there were some citizen journalists who were then recruited perhaps into mainstream journalism and who shut down their blogs and started writing for mainstream sites. Again, Salam Pax is an example of that. In Australia, we had a guy called Tim Dunlop who was hired by News Corporation, did some blogging for them, and then they started to censor him and he went back to his own blog, basically. So these sorts of things happen, of course, as well. But essentially, there was a very clear demarcation between citizen journalists and professional journalists. Now, however, all of that happens, in addition to these sites, also in social media platforms. So now, the Twitter account of the New York Times is not functionally different from my Twitter account or your Twitter account. The Twitter account of a major journalist is not functionally different from anyone else's Twitter account. So now they exist within the same space. They mix and mingle and connect and engage and argue at each other within the same space. And you've got all of these groups. You've got, of course, the traditional groups, journalists and editors and so on, but you've also got their sources, the journalists, the pundits, the experts, the scholars. You've got ordinary users. You've got bots, of course, as well, of various forms. So all of them now exist within that same space. And that space is not operated by the journalism outlets, the news outlets, the companies. It's not operated by citizen journalists and ordinary citizens, but it's operated by a third party, by the platform providers themselves. So that makes a very significant difference. All of them, all of us, are essentially guests on social media platforms, are essentially living by the rules of Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and everyone else, rather than being able to make their own rules in these spaces. That's a really significant shift, and that, I think, is a very major change in the power structure between conventional journalism, traditional journalism, legacy journalism, professional journalism, whatever you want to call it, citizen journalism, and everyone else who's also in that space. So, and of course that change hasn't completed yet, so I want to acknowledge, and Andrew Chadwick has written about this, that this is still very much a hybrid system. Of course, you still have newspapers and broadcasting on radio and TV. You still have the sites as well, but increasingly, as we've seen from the graph by the Reuters Institute, increasingly it's social media where you don't have these distinctions nearly as strongly developed that people go to first as their first and their main source of the news. So this hybrid system is very much driven and connected by social media now. And I think I like this formulation by Wipke Losen and Jan Schmidt. Journalism and audiences and everyone else meet on uncommon ground. I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it, in a space that isn't controlled by any of them, that none of them really understand fully, partly because the platforms keep changing, of course, as well. So we're all in this third space, in this sort of space that we inhabit only at the pleasure of the platform providers themselves, and they could kick us off anytime they like. But what happens in these spaces are these spontaneously emerging encounter publics, issue publics, ad hoc publics, whatever you'd like to call them, that form around shared interests, shared events, that form when there's something happening in the world, that form when there is a debate going on, like the Me Too debate at the moment, for instance, in the US and elsewhere, that form around scandals, that form around events, that form around just breaking news stories and so on. So that enables people to come together around a particular topic and try and work out together what the hell's going on, basically. So Habermas doesn't get any of this, of course. How should he? But in some ways it realizes something that he's talked about at least a little bit in the margins of his work, the wild flows of messages. And he's sort of saying this kind of outside of the public sphere proper, that for him consists of the mainstream news channels and so on. This is really what happens when people talk about the news along, within their social networks and so on. And I think what's happening here is just that central part of the public sphere is shrinking, and the space, the network space for these wild flows of messages, of information, of news, of updates, of commentary, of opinion, that's grown by comparison. So we're much more reliant now on our social networks for access to what's going on and for interpretation of what's going on than necessarily the mainstream news outlets themselves. So it's the balance that has shifted here, I think would be my argument. And in many ways, this idea of the random acts of journalism that Lassiter was talking about never really came to pass, because you have to be far more prepared to be random about this. But essentially what is happening in social media now is that we're all habitually sharing news stories with our social networks. We see things and retweet them, we share them via Facebook, we pass them on in some form. So this gatewatching, which to me again is looking at what's coming through the various channels that we're connected to, and then responding to that, sharing it on, amplifying it, commenting on it, curating it, that has become much more habitual now for many social media users. If I asked in the room how many of you have in this week shared a news story with your social networks, many of your hands would go up, I'm sure. So this has become very much a habitual act for many of us. Not so much random anymore, but just something that we all kind of do without even much thinking about it. And in fact, the fact that we're not much thinking about it is, of course, also where fake news comes in, because that exploits the idea that many of us will just share a headline because it sounds interesting without necessarily reading the article. So this is not democratic. And, again, Clay Shirky was talking about the democratization of opinion. It's still not that. We don't all have equal voices. If I share something, it's seen by a lot fewer people than if some major journalist or some major news organization shares something, of course. But in some ways it's become demotic, because many of us in a really wide swathe of society are engaged in it. We don't have the same voices, but this is now a popular pursuit. This is something that across the population many, many people are doing with whatever social media they're using. That's an important distinction, I think, to make, and we'll never get, I think, to a point where everyone simply has an equal voice. So I don't want to claim that this is a democratic process, but I think it is demotic now. And in many ways, because we're all in this third space, it is actually us as ordinary users or experts or whatever we are, working together with journalists to curate the news collectively. Maybe the journalists don't actually want to work together with us, but we're simply in the same space, so they can't escape that process. So between all of us, we are actually curating the news, again, crowdsourcing things to prominence, making things more visible, responding, critiquing, putting two different stories together to play them off against each other or for them to complement each other. So this is really what's happening in this space now, a collective form of news curation, particularly, again, around those breaking news stories, around these major points of discussion, these major publics that emerge in this context as well. And I said habitual, and this graph actually I think is a good illustration of that. There's two things I want to say about this graph. First, it's a really, really bad visualization. Sorry. Because you see there the 48 there looks a lot smaller than the 21 and the 31. So that's, again, and I'm sorry to say it's from the Reuters Institute again, so maybe they need some more visualization people involved. But having said that, though, if you look just at these two, which do look a lot bigger than the 48, but which add up to 52%, essentially more than half of these users, these social media users, have been involved in some form of participatory engagement with the news, in what I would call gatewatching, in sharing the news, in curating the news. If you look at the various things that they're doing there, of course, at the top are the most heavy involvement things: write a blog post or something, take part in a campaign, comment on a news story on a social network, on a news website, but also then share a story via a social network, via email, rate or favorite a news story, which again makes it more visible, of course, on a site or in a social network, vote in an online poll, and so on. So more than half of us are now engaged, and this is within an average week, in something that I would call gatewatching, news sharing, news curation. So that's what I mean by habitual. We are now in a space where this has become second nature to at least 52% of us. And that's, again, why I'd call it habitual, why I call it demotic. So many of us are now engaged in this sort of process. It's no longer just a handful of self-selecting and probably demographically quite narrow citizen journalists, but it's a much broader base across society who are engaged in this sort of thing. And of course, well, that's again one of these things that challenges the news industry, that challenges journalists, and they've had a very hard time finding an appropriate response to these sorts of developments. Now, practically with every new technology that's come along in journalism, the first response has been negative. That's been the case for the telegraph, that's been the case for mechanized printing presses, that's been the case for the internet itself, the web. Every time something new comes along, journalists tend to respond quite conservatively, quite negatively, and say, well, we've never had this before, we don't need it, this is just going to make the profession worse. So the first response with social media has also been to belittle and vilify social media platforms and their uses. We've got an Australian in the room, so maybe you'll know who Chris Mitchell is as the editor of The Australian, who, of course, and The Australian, for those of you who don't know, is a very far right-wing conservative newspaper in Australia, who said that Twitter is little more than a left-wing echo chamber and we should have nothing to do with it. And any journalist who engages with it is probably not doing the profession any favors. And, you know, some of them have even gone as far as making it very difficult for people to actually share the news, to share news articles via social media, to share them on. So they've built paywalls. They've introduced premium access. You know, all of these barriers that say you can only read 3 articles from the Washington Post in one month or you have to pay for it. Yes, that makes sense from a commercial point of view, but it also very much reduces the sharing of their news stories within social media. So it very much reduces the visibility of that news organization within a social media space. Against which the editor of the Guardian has said, well, newspapers should want to be open and collaborative. They should want to circulate. They should want their news to get out there, obviously, and have an impact. That is, frankly, also easy to say for the Guardian, which doesn't necessarily depend directly on its revenue because it's funded by a trust. So, of course, for them, as well as for public broadcasters, who again don't directly depend on sales, it's a lot easier to be open and collaborative, of course, than for commercial entities that are struggling already. So I do want to acknowledge that as well. Now, this negative response has been revisited mostly when there's been some breakthrough event in the country. So This is an Australian journalist after one of our many political leadership crises that we've had over the last few years. And in fact, this was after the first major of those crises. She was already on Twitter, and as she says there, I can't tell you how many times I've heard journals admit that they better get into this Twitter thing, because suddenly Twitter was the place where you could hear from politicians, hear from other journalists what was going on, whether there would be a leadership challenge, whether there would be a change or not. So suddenly journalists realized this is an important medium when something new happened, when there's a major change in politics in some form, or of course major terrorist attacks, major natural disasters and so on as well. Often the response then has been to create these, what have sometimes been called social media editors, community editors, social media evangelists. There's been a number of terms for these sorts of things, but basically people have said, well, we need to get our newsroom onto social media, so we'll pick someone from the team who's already well connected, and their task is then to encourage other journalists to set up their social media accounts, to understand how social media works, to get into this Twitter thing, and start to learn how to perhaps do journalism via social media as well. And for many of these jobs, actually, they're successful when they're no longer needed. So the Guardian's head of digital entertainment said in this interview with Joy Meyer, I'm going to be successful when my job is obsolete, when I'm no longer needed, when everyone is on social media, and I no longer have to train anyone up to use social media amongst my colleagues. So this is a passing phase, perhaps, that is really about teaching everyone to use social media, get everyone on board, and then hopefully people are starting to connect and starting to participate. At the level of individual journalists, so this was really the industry's response. At the level of individual journalists, well, increasingly now they've started to accept social media as just a tool of the trade, particularly amongst younger professionals. And in fact, for those who, and that's almost everyone these days, who's working in quite a precarious environment, of course, because journalism jobs are disappearing, it's actually an important aspect to their employability, being able to use social media effectively, being able to show that they have a strong social media presence already. If you haven't already made it as a journalist, as Sylvia Costello from the BBC User-Generated Content Hub, by the way, so if you haven't made it already as a journalist, you won't become a journalist unless you have your social media presence. And in many ways, then that can then also be used, of course, to keep a job, even in this very complicated, very difficult environment. It's now in many ways individuals. It's the individual journalist social media account as well. That's the fundamental unit. So people actually start following individual journalists as much as they follow the news organizations on Twitter or on Facebook. So they become much more important in the same way that previously, when cable TV first came in, the news anchor became a much more important journalistic feature as well, and they became the first kind of personalities. Now, all the journalists on social media have to present themselves as individual personalities as well. And again, this brings them back perhaps also to more sourcing of information, getting involved in social media as something that works as a newswire as well, that enables them to pick up on new developments as they're happening, and of course engage with the sources that they might have, and finally also use this as a news outlet to promote the stories when they publish them. And this is a good example. I don't know if any of you recognize this guy. I'm guessing not. This is Andy Carvin. Andy Carvin, and Alfred Hermida has written quite a bit about him with his colleagues. He became one of the major sources of news and updates during the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012. So he, and you kind of see how he operates there. He's got his Twitter feeds on both those side screens. He's got a screen there with a news article from ABC News in the US in the middle. So he simply happened to have a very good network of contacts around the Arab world, around the Middle East. And he pulled together all of these updates from different sources, particularly via Twitter and via social media, and reposted them, commented on them, brought them together in his own feed, in his own Twitter feed. So his Twitter feed actually became the go-to source for up-to-date information, kind of vetted by him and obviously selected, curated by him. So if you wanted to find out what was really going on there, you didn't need to follow everyone who was perhaps saying something about this. You followed Andy Carvin, and you relied on him basically to pull all of this together, put it into context, give some added commentary perhaps. And he did all of this not from Cairo or Alexandria or anywhere in the region. He did it from some office at NPR in Washington, D.C. So he's not even working for a major news organization. He's working for a little old national public radio in the US, which is chronically underfunded. And he's not even technically a journalist. He's a social media person at NPR. So here's someone who's kind of come in from the sidelines to bring together all of this content, to curate all of this content, simply because he had these sources and he could work social media effectively to bring all of that information together. So that's the sort of news curator role that's emerging in this kind of context, to the point where obviously he needed some protective gloves to keep himself from carpal tunnel syndrome from doing this all the time. He was incredibly active during this time. And there are a few other people that have emerged in the same vein more recently as well around other topics and other issues. So this is the sort of the new journalistic role that is also becoming possible within the social media space, of course. So where does all of this take us then? That's sort of where, in a sense, where we're at now, I guess. This sort of incomplete but fairly progressed adaptation of social media in or for journalistic purposes. And of course, the widespread take-up of Facebook and Twitter and other platforms by news audiences as, again, their main source of the news. And in many ways, again, this has reshaped the networks. This has reshaped the environment in which news happens and is disseminated and commented upon, discussed, and so on. In the first place, it's enabled politicians as well to bypass journalism, and that's perhaps one of the most complicated things. Marcel Brosma and Todd Graham there write about this idea of the journalistic interview as negotiation through conversation. And politicians and other sources can bypass that now. They're writing here particularly about Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, but the best example these days is, of course, Donald Trump. He doesn't need to give interviews. When he does, like he did to 60 Minutes the other day, it's a train wreck. So he works through Twitter. He puts out his pronouncements via Twitter. He can't be questioned because he never does any press conference. Well, he does a few press conferences, but you know what they're like. He certainly doesn't do any proper interviews. So this enables a politician to essentially no longer expose themselves to direct scrutiny by journalists. They can just directly communicate with their audiences, with their voters via social media. So there's a reshaping of the network that bypasses journalism altogether, and it's obviously not a positive development. Journalists themselves have sometimes worried that if they're all connecting now also via social media, that it just generates an echo chamber, that it just reinforces the groupthink that sort of exists in the US terms inside the Beltway. And this is from a journalist who works in that environment, who was interviewed by John Parmalee. But at the same time, it doesn't need to be this way as well. And Paul Bradshaw from the Online Journalism blog has said something very smart, I think, that of course what filter bubble or otherwise we live in depends on who we follow and what choices we make in who we connect with. So yes, of course, if all of these journalists only connect with each other and only engage with each other via social media, then that could become an echo chamber or a filter bubble. But of course, they can also break out of that by following a diverse range of accounts, by engaging with a diverse range of people, and that also is possible via social media. And again, the same journalist that Parmalee interviewed also says, well, all of this groupthink that has already existed inside the Beltway, at the press table, around major events, for instance. All of that, if that now happens on Twitter publicly, of course the public also now has a chance to respond, to see what we talk about, to see how we talk about it, and to respond to that and engage and criticize and offer alternative perspectives. And a smart journalist will actually start to listen to that, start to take in what at least the social media public thinks as well, and not just listen to their own colleagues, and not just engage exclusively with their own colleagues via social media. So it enables them perhaps to have more of a finger on the pulse of the public, or at least the social media using public in this way. So in many ways, yes, there is more groupthink and there are more concerns about echo chambers and filter bubbles, but it also exposes all of this much more publicly to scrutiny by the general public, by, of course, the politicians and their sources and everyone else too. And but what it really does ultimately, of course, is that it is able to remove journalists as sort of a part of the process. It can bypass journalists in a social media environment as well. So that is that can be a problem if it reduces public scrutiny of politicians. But it also means that, of course, politicians who may be underrepresented in the media or misreported in the mainstream media can also get their views out directly to the public, and that can also be a good thing. So the question then is this a process of normalization in the same way that blogs were normalized in that first wave of citizen media, in the same way that essentially mainstream journalism kind of tamed the bloggers, got them involved in mainstream journalism processes? Well, in some ways, yes, Twitter and other social media platforms have become an inherent part of the journalist toolkit, and they're recognizing this as well. It's increasing their visibility, their popularity. They need to as well in this precarious environment, as this journalist there says, you become a walking, talking, texting, tweeting, whatever billboard for yourself in order to get the next job, in order to get the next employment, in order, particularly as a freelancer or someone working for a company that is in some way problematic, isn't sustainable, in order to get the next job. So the more visible you make yourself, the better it is for you. But that's also a problem, because if and this is Ulrike Hedman who said, well, does journalism now include not only the content but also the journalists themselves? So is it now important to do this personal branding, to become a personal brand? If so, that very likely disadvantages people of minority backgrounds, of particular ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, of a different gender identity, women more generally as well, because we know that women journalists get attacked more on social media than male journalists. So if that's the case, then this might also push people out of the journalistic profession who are likely to be more attacked, more ferociously attacked than a white male Anglo mainstream journalist might be. So this is also very problematic. If you do now engage in journalistic branding, it might actually make the journalistic profession even more monocultural, if you like, because anyone who identifies as gay, Muslim, black, female, whatever it is that the trolls will most likely attack, might be pushed out of journalism in this way if at some point they feel that it's getting too much. So this is also very problematic, I think, as a development, and particularly in these times when we know that trolling and abuse is being leveled at journalists from so many directions, from the various extremist points of view, particularly. So this, I think, is a problematic question as well. So, in one sense, some journalists might say, yes, I've kind of normalized, I've integrated social media into journalism itself. I've brought this into my toolkit. This is now part of how I work as a journalist. But for me, I kind of see maybe the other direction as well, that journalism itself is actually being normalized into social media, that it's actually increasingly journalism being driven by the logics of social media rather than social media being integrated into the logic of journalism. And we see this again by the fact that journalists now have to be branding themselves. We see it in the fact that first breaking news stories now happen on social media, and that very often they happen before they've been fully verified as well. So the logic of social media, which is quick, get it out there, get others to respond to it and so on, now seems to be taking over to some extent the logic of journalism. And that is a very different story from what happened 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when blogs first and citizen journalism first arose and were gradually just tamed and integrated into journalism proper, and journalism proper kind of continued in the way it had. So there's a real shift here, I think, that's going on as well. And ultimately, of course, the fundamental question, as always in a commercial environment, is, well, if journalists are freely available on social media, if their content is freely available on social media, on Twitter and other platforms, well, who pays the bills for any of this? How is professional commercial journalism still sustainable in that context? And that's not an answer, but it's part of it's a symptom of what's going on now. So we're seeing the increasing metrification of journalism. This is from the digital news report, actually, just an example of what this looks like. This is the sort of tool that mainstream commercial journalism operators now use in order to monitor the performance of the stories that they publish. You see there the tabs, stories, syndication, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, how are the influencers responding, how are the creators responding, and so on. So essentially with every story that they publish, they can now see their metrics on various platforms. They can see how many people have read it, liked it, tweeted it, shared it, and so on. They can do testing as well. Often journalism news organizations are now experimenting with A/B testing of different headlines, for instance. Does this headline or that headline for the same story result in more shares? Does this image or that image attached to the same story result in more shares? There was one story I read where they tested whether, if it's a murder case, if you show a picture of the victim or a picture of the murderer, if it gets more shares. And it's usually the victim picture that gets more shares. So it gets kind of nasty in a sense as well in this context. So we are seeing this kind of metrification of the performance of news sites, of news stories, ultimately of journalists, of course, themselves as well, constantly now in any kind of mainstream news organization. So this kind of systematic quantitative analysis of audience behavior and so on. However, there's a problem because many of these tools aren't really keeping up with how people actually are using social media. This is a wonderful line from a report that came out in 2016, so quite recently, that says contemporary forms of analytics are very good at understanding the main ways in which people use digital media in 2010. Which isn't good enough, obviously, because things have moved on. So there's still a lot of focus on how people on desktop computers are using the news, when we know that the vast majority of news consumption now is via mobile devices. So we've got a lot of work still to do developing metrics that actually really represent how people are using the news currently, rather than just how they're using them through the devices that they had 8 years ago. And in many ways, too, the people who are working in the newsrooms don't really know what to do with this. I love this quote. You kind of imagine him saying this. It's like crack, he said, grinning. You can sit there and watch it popping all night. You just see the numbers going up and down. You think, oh, we've got a success there. That story is doing really well, and so on. So a lot of excitement that something's doing well, and disappointment that something else isn't doing well, but they have no idea what it means or why. They can see, yes, this is doing well. Does that then just mean we have to do more of that? Let's report some more murder cases or whatever. Well, that can't be it. They have to do it because the same interviewer, as he says there, if the company is not making money, I might get laid off. So I have to meet my performance indicators. I have to meet my KPIs. I have to get the right metrics in order to keep my job. But none of us actually know what any of this means, and we just chase these metrics because we're told from management that we need to chase these metrics. And of course, if there is a metric that's seen as important, news outlets, like anyone else, will try to game it. Will try to chase that metric and make it grow. For a while there, for instance, the big metric that everyone was chasing was page views. That was the main thing. How many pages have people viewed on our site? And so what they did was, rather than have the story on one page, they split it up over 2 or 3 pages. So suddenly for the same story, you had 2 or 3 page views, and your metrics went up. Doesn't mean that more people are coming to your site or more stories are getting read. It's just you make it more annoying for readers to actually read the whole thing. And by the way, this guy, Jonah Peretti, who's saying that, knows a bit about this. He's the founder of BuzzFeed. So if anyone knows about metrics and about how to game metrics, then it's obviously BuzzFeed. But he's also saying, well, it's built around this idea that journalism will happen primarily through social networks, that journalism will be distributed primarily through social networks. So BuzzFeed doesn't really have a homepage. It's just got all of these shareable stories. At the same time, of course, if you followed BuzzFeed, now it uses the money it makes from all of these stupid celebrity stories and listicles and everything else. It's used that in many countries now to hire serious journalists to do serious journalism. And it's pushing that into its feed from time to time in order to make sure that people actually get the real stories and not just whatever Charles and Camilla are doing, or Felipe and whatever her name is, your king. Sorry, yes. This sort of thing is basically, this is happening as well. That the shareable game content is now subsidizing the other stuff, the proper journalism, the important journalism as well. And so whatever it is, though, there's an increasing feedback loop between the gatekeeping that happens in these news organizations and what I would call gatewatching. The audience is responding, sharing, engaging, participating, and so on as well. So before that, before we had social media, this was measured in audience ratings for the TV broadcast, or it was in circulation ratings for newspapers, and it was reported once a night or once a week or once a month. Now this is an ongoing live feed of data on how many people have clicked on a story and shared it and so on. So suddenly all of this has sped up to real time, basically, and of course that affects the evolution, if you like, of journalism, of journalistic coverage, much more strongly now than ever before. And of course, in all of this, the platforms have enormous power because that's where the metrics come from. So, journalists are, as Ali Nabil Ahmad says, they're a very useful source of marketing for Twitter. Lots of people are on Twitter because that's where the news is, that's where the journalists are. But of course, the journalists don't actually get money from this. 65% of the ad revenue is going to 5 tech companies, not to any of the news organizations. That's probably even risen further now. So the money is going back to Google and Facebook and Twitter and Apple and all the others, not to the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the other news outlets. So, whether you agree with the language or not, but they've become appendages of Americanized corporate information capitalism. However you translate that, but there's some truth to this. They've become content providers and access drivers, but it's the platforms that benefit from this. And of course, the news organizations want the audiences, but they'd also like to get a share of the money. So this is the trade-off that they now have to make. Do you just post on your own sites and no one sees it, or fewer people see it? Or do you post on Twitter and Facebook and many people see it, but you can't make money from it, or much less money from it? And of course, at the same time, Facebook and all the others will say, well, we're definitely not a media company. No, we're just we're just a communications platform. What happens on our platform, that's up to the users. We have nothing to do with that. We don't have the responsibilities that a media company has for curating, for censoring information, for making sure that there's no fake news on our platforms and so on. Well, that argument still persists, but it probably won't persist for too much longer because obviously now in the age of fake news, in the age of Macedonian factories of fake news producers and so on, all of that is gradually changing as well. So what needs to happen though is that some more of the revenue actually needs to go to the content producers rather than just to the platforms. Maybe this whole panic about fake news and everything else that's connected to it will lead to more regulatory intervention, will lead to more government intervention to try and reroute some of those revenue streams. Having said that, the legislature that probably has the most power to do this is Congress in the US, and they don't have the will. The legislature that probably has the most knowledge about it is the EU Parliament, but they don't have the power. So, and of course, individual national governments simply have neither the will nor the power, probably. So how exactly this could be made to happen, particularly in the very problematic current political environment, remains to be seen. But if there's ever been some leverage to change how the money flows are going here, then it probably is now, and it probably is why people are still concerned about fake news. So we had this, this is the 3 legal leads for Facebook, Google, and Twitter fronting up to Congress. We've had Commander Data himself front up to Congress, and of course give very meaningless answers ultimately. I don't have the picture here, I think, of him showing up for a brief meeting at the European Parliament and just saying, oh, sorry, I've got to go now. I've talked to you for half an hour. That's got to be enough. I've got to go now. So, they've shown up, they've said things, but no one's really done anything further so far. And all that they've done is just make some gestures that, yes, we'll behave better in future, but nothing much has changed ultimately, and nothing much probably will. So that's the sort of the overall kind of argument, I guess, that I'm outlining in the book. Now, if you want just the quick summary, I think that's always quite useful. There is a major generational shift, I think, going on now towards social media as the primary news source. Again, the Reuters Institute data show that very clearly. And for many of these social media users, gatewatching and news sharing has now become habitual. We're all I think if we're on social media, receiving news directly or serendipitously via social media, and occasionally we pass these on, habitually perhaps we pass these on to our own networks. So this has become a mainstream practice that we engage in, not always very carefully, very cautiously. Sometimes we just share it because it looks interesting without even having read it, but we do this. And these social media spaces are not owned by the journalism providers nor by us, but they are tertiary spaces that do not inherently privilege any one player other than the platform providers themselves. So there's a reshaping of the networks, there's a reshaping of the balance of power that's going on in these spaces, which creates new opportunities for journalists. They can become news curators like Andy Carvin has done, and they can create their personal brands, but of course only some journalists will have the ability and the nous to do that. And the question then is, well, is this actually journalism normalizing social media, journalism integrating social media into its professional practices, or is journalism being pulled into the logics of social media and is kind of drowning within this social media space where it can no longer even draw on its imprimatur, its imprint as a separate space? Are journalists now almost indistinguishable from other knowledgeable social media users, for instance, as they engage in these spaces? And because so much more of this happens on social media now, the funding remains incredibly precarious, obviously, and where the funding goes relies largely on the metrics that are being generated, which may promote populism, which certainly will invite gaming of these metrics. The platforms continue to siphon off most of the revenue that comes from all of this. So again, this fundamentally undermines and threatens professional, mainstream industrial journalism. So in some way, I think we will have to find a way to enforce the corporate social responsibility of these platforms. But that will prove very difficult because they are now bigger than most countries in terms of their annual revenues. So they are very powerful operators. And that's the gloomy note, I think, on which I'll end. But that's where we are at this point, I think. And we'll have to find a way to move beyond this, I think, into the future, to find a way to make journalism sustainable in whatever form, whatever shape it might take in the future. So that's sort of the overall outline of the book. Obviously, there's more in there, but that's the broad argument, basically, of the book. So with that, thank you, and I hope I've gone too much over time, but maybe we'll have a little bit of time for questions still as well. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you for this inspiring presentation. Thank you very much, Axel. Well, we have 15 to 20 minutes more or less for questions. If any of you would like to ask anything to Axel, this is your opportunity. Anyone? People in journalism and social media mainly? No.
Loud enough.
Yep. Well, we're recording it as well, so that's why. Yeah.
No. Thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. One of the points that I keep coming back to was a few slides back, when you talked about whether journalists are necessary, or I think you even said they might not be necessary in this sort of ecosystem that we have of news. But I go back to the point, if there isn't a professional production of journalists, then what is everybody talking about? I mean, I think there's still very much gatekeepers in that sense, which is that, all of us might have been tweeting right now, but with all due respect, if this doesn't get picked up by La Vanguardia, it's probably not going to make the news tomorrow morning in Barcelona. You gave this talk, I'm using it as an example. So where do you see the role of, I guess I'm going to use the word professional journalists in this ecosystem that you have?
Well, and you're right. I mean, for ordinary events, if journalists don't report it, yes, probably it won't be picked up. But at the same time, for politicians, for celebrities, for the other sources within a social media space who already have a lot of followers, who have a large audience, they can bypass journalism altogether, basically. So that's very problematic because, again, it shifts the power, of course. It shifts the power to those who have these large audiences through whatever means possible. And of course, this is to some extent also one of the factors in the rise of celebrity politicians, for instance. Donald Trump became president not because he performed well via the mainstream media, because he already had a very large audience as well. And he could use that audience to mobilize voters. I mean, even Barack Obama in some ways became that because he built his own social network initially, myBarackObama.com, and through that mobilized people to vote for him, even when many mainstream media reporters were still, at that point, even backing Hillary Clinton. So in that sense, it might lead again to a celebrification of all of this, to the classics of the rich get richer kind of syndrome, where people who have a large following will be able to make themselves heard via social media as well, and they don't need journalists, and they might quite actively avoid journalistic scrutiny. But yes, you're right. Other things that journalists might report about that they no longer do because they no longer have the resources to do so, that becomes much more problematic. And that means that perhaps civil society organizations, for instance, might need to invest in doing their own social media and generating a lot of followers. I mean, we see this with protests and with emerging movements as well. Very often, mainstream journalists might not pick up on them until they become big, and they have to build their own groundswell in order to become visible. Maybe even Me Too is an example of that, I think, because really that started with celebrities speaking out, I guess, and encouraging other women to speak out as well. So that was almost against the reluctance of mainstream journalism, perhaps, to reveal some of these stories about celebrities that they had a good relationship with and that they relied on as sources of stories as well. So that's the shift. I'm not saying it's a positive shift, but I think there is that shift that if journalism shrinks and journalism kind of can be bypassed, then who's doing the bypassing essentially? Yeah. Self-organizing. It's good.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry I was late. I lost some part, but it was really interesting. I have a lot of ideas, so I will try to connect the ideas as much as I can. I strongly believe that social media is a great way to show and give voice to other people that have no voice or something else like that. And also it's like a challenge for journalism, because I truly believe that journalists has a responsibility to prove or to try to prove the news before to share some comments, because their opinion will be more big. You know, we're more strong in the I don't know, the tendency topics or something like that. But in this way of who is more or who influences more, there's the word, by the way, influencers. So I want to ask you about what do you think of the role of these new influencers, that doesn't matter if they are young or celebrities or whatever, but they have a very big audiences and they are always talking about different topics. Yep.
I mean, that almost continues from that question as well, because it is, again, those influencers who are particularly powerful. And yeah, some of them might genuinely be interested in the betterment of society and engage, in topics that are of public importance. Some of them might just promote themselves and their own ideas, products, commercial deals and so on. Some of them might be constructed in order to push fake news into the mainstream as well. But that's precisely what I'm saying. If journalists themselves can be bypassed, if they can be pushed to the sidelines, and these influences are where more and more people are getting perhaps their news from through a social network, then the question really is, well, who are they? And what kind of, we as users, as we follow them and as we rely on them perhaps, how much power do we actually give them in doing so? So that's, to some extent, that's also a question of media literacy, of social media literacy perhaps, that as a social media user, if I follow all these influencers, okay, but maybe I should then also have the critical perspective in mind to say, well, do I really know who this person is? They post interesting content and I share what they're posting, but do I really know who they are? Do I really know who that person is? What their ideology is, what their personal perspective is, whether they're getting paid for doing this, whether they're actually a real person or just a Russian bot. So, as a user, as I follow them, and particularly as I share on content, I then have a great responsibility as well to really critically reflect on what I'm doing and not just click retweet, retweet, retweet all the time. It's a word to really say. It's difficult to say that very quickly. So to do this all the time and without thinking about, well, should I really share this? Can I really trust this? So in many ways, going back to your initial point about verification, if journalism is being bypassed and we're now all sharing the news, then we should, in a sense, employ more of the journalistic logic of verification. And that might mean only sharing something once you've seen it independently from two different sources, like a journalist would, or more than two, and not just the first thing that comes to mind. All of us have probably been caught up sharing a story that turned out to be wrong, just because it was there first, and someone said, "Oh, something's happening." So maybe we all have to learn, in a sense, to think like journalists there, and say, "Well, okay, I've seen this, I'll wait until someone else reports the same thing, and then maybe I'll share it," rather than just click retweet immediately once we see it. So that would be the return of journalistic logic into social media logic. So maybe that's the next step, in a sense, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, and very interesting conference. I was about to talk about influencers, so I thought, oh no, it's asking my question. But the thing is that I wanted to ask you if the influencer, Instagrammer phenomenon is just a bubble, or it's just they have arrived to stay here, because lately here in Spain, some media, some TVs, newspapers are starting to hire influencers. Yesterday I was hearing about a very famous influencer, YouTuber in Spain, doing interviews in El País, one of the main newspapers in Spain, also some in the radio, and it's just that they are intruding the journalism area, the professional, so it's a little bit scary. And I just want to know your opinion.
And in some ways, where that happens, that's almost like what happened in the first wave, right? When bloggers were first hired to blog, to write for newspapers. So that's a form of normalization of influencers into mainstream journalism. So some of that will happen. Of course, other influencers are likely to take their place. And I think, more broadly, the idea of a social media influencer will probably be around for as long as there's social media. But who these people are, the individual people, will change, because some of them, particularly in a more commercial space, tend to get caught out because someone finds out that they're promoting a product because they've been paid for it rather than because it's really good. So there's been some cases with beauty bloggers, for instance, and travel bloggers and so on, or influencers who have these fantastic Instagram streams of photos from whatever vacation they've taken, and then it turns out that they were hired, they were paid by the travel company to do that. When that sort of thing comes out, then often they get dumped by their followers, basically, because people feel that that's inauthentic. With YouTubers, there's a similar sort of story where people can rise quickly, but then they can also fall quickly. Like PewDiePie is an example of that, obviously, and others who just have at some point revealed, for instance, that they've got strange political views or whatever. That they might be a nice guy on camera, but ultimately, suddenly they start supporting the alt-right or something like that. So you get these sorts of developments, of course, and that person might disappear, but then the audience will probably move on somewhere else and find some other influencer. I guess, some of them might be hired and certainly will be hired into more professional roles. And that's very much what we've seen with bloggers. Matt Drudge from the Drudge Report obviously started out that way and became a media company in its own right. That might also happen with some of these influencers, that they just become commercial operators.
So maybe we will see in a few years universities offering a degree on influencer, maybe?
There are. Google or YouTube is already doing these YouTube, I forget what they're calling them, but they have these sort of intensive courses in collaboration with universities on filmmaking, on video making, on how to get more professional in how they create their content. And my university, I know you've got film studies here as well. The people who study film studies, TV studies at universities, some of them will become professional YouTubers. That's the yeah.
From advertising.
Absolutely, yeah. My colleague Stuart Cunningham has been studying professional or semi-professional YouTubers in Australia and the US for some time. Some of them end up in Hollywood, So that sort of thing certainly happens. There is that kind of movement. Absolutely, of course. In the news space, well, it remains to be seen. Some of them might just become journalists in some form, or might become commentators, pundits, something, I guess, yeah. On a slightly side note, but because I've talked about Andy Carvin as the sort of news curator, in the last year or so, I've been following a guy called Seth Abramson from the US, who is actually a journalism professor in New Hampshire, and he's become one of the key curators on Trump, on the Trump-Russia collusion story particularly. So he's incredibly active day to day. He is writing these long Twitter threads over 50 posts or whatever, talking about the latest news story that proves again another part of the picture of how Trump worked with Putin and so on. And he's now got a book coming out with Simon & Schuster. In fact, I think it's literally just come out. So that's an influencer, if you like. He's got 500,000 followers on Twitter, so he's certainly an influencer. Someone who's come out of kind of nowhere, just as someone who is able to do news curation well via Twitter, and then turns that into a fully fledged book about the Trump-Russia affair, basically. So that's an example of that as well, basically. Is on your other side? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you about business models. I think that's the main topic to protect the news organization's autonomy.
Yep.
So there's a new shift toward direct payment from readers through subscriptions. And I wanted to ask you if you see that trend and what do you think about readers paying directly for investigative journalism?
It seems to work at the moment. There's all these stories about the New York Times and the Washington Post, of course, suddenly getting a lot more subscribers after Trump was elected. That's been happening, but it's been happening for these elite media particularly. I don't know that it happens across the board for ordinary regional and local newspapers or news websites. I think they have been profiting essentially from Donald Trump, from their critical coverage of Donald Trump. And there might be The Guardian and a few others that work in this way as well. But I don't really see that as a really widespread trend. I think it might be something that's limited to these leading, clearly exceptional news organizations. I think it might also be limited to the Trump era. So if Trump disappears at some point and the US hopefully goes back to normal, then maybe people will actually no longer continue their subscriptions because they may no longer see a real need to be so well informed, essentially. So I think this may be an aberration. And at the moment, yes, paywalls and subscription models seem to work in these few cases. The Guardian also has been doing well, but I think that might be an exception from the rule, frankly. The problem with all of this is that it also makes this content somewhat less visible because it's harder to share. If you can't get access to something, you're not going to share it via social media. Now, they've had these kind of partial paywalls where some content is freely available or where you get to read 5 or 10 stories or whatever per month perhaps, or less than that. So you can read it, you can share it, and you can, maybe that entices you then to subscribe as well. But I don't think it's a really fundamental model for news overall. I think it really works for the elite news media. What does obviously become more important at the present moment are models like The Guardian, which is not directly reliant, while it will constantly ask you for money, of course, but it's not relying on that money because it's funded by the Scott Trust. And the Scott Trust makes money from other investments, and some of that money goes to The Guardian to sustain it. So that model works. The model of public broadcasting, of course, works to a point. And in a sense, The Guardian almost works like a public broadcaster because it doesn't need to make the money back that it's given by the trust. Public broadcasting is more problematic, though, from another point of view, and that is, depending on how the model is set up, that there can be very direct political interference from the government, or, you know, that just, the revenue might go down. Again, depending on how it's set up, if it's done via a license fee, coupled to whether people have a TV or not, of course, fewer and fewer people have TVs or radios. So that it depends how that model is set up and whether that works. I think what we might see is more sort of Guardian-style trust models, essentially, where somehow the news organization is funded by profits from some other enterprise. You could actually say something like that almost for the Washington Post as well, because that's funded by Jeff Bezos, right? So of Amazon, am I right? Am I mixing it up? Yeah. So in some ways, it's Amazon and Amazon's profits that sustain the New York Times. The Washington Post. Yeah. So while that doesn't quite work exactly in the same way as the Scott Trust, maybe if Jeff Bezos dies, maybe it'll convert into some sort of trust fund. But essentially, that sort of model where a major tech entrepreneur or some other person with lots of money buys up a paper like this and then runs it in that way. You could frankly even say the same thing about many of the News Corp newspapers, because they're funded by the profits from Fox, 20th Century Fox and other entertainment enterprises. You know, I talked about the Australian, the major national, highly conservative newspaper in Australia. That's never made any money. It's a vanity paper, basically, for Rupert Murdoch, who funds it in order to have political influence in Australia, not because it's in any way, you know, successful. And in fact, there's been ongoing speculation that if Rupert Murdoch dies at some point, the next thing that dies will be the Australian, because any investor who looks at it will say, well, why are we spending millions of dollars each year on this thing that no one reads? You know, so this. But that's the model, I think, also in news, that there are now some entrepreneurs who, for good or bad reasons, for ego-driven reasons, or because they genuinely believe in the importance of independent news, will divert some of their riches to sustain an independent news enterprise. But that's
in Latin America, there are a lot of small digital newspapers funded by the Open Society.
Yeah, and that sort of thing, exactly. So that sort of stuff might happen at a very hyper-local level. You might get that local subscription model again, though, too, because if you have a local paper that's run almost certainly independently and almost at a sort of semi-professional level by locals, then maybe people in that neighborhood might also support that because they want their local news, not just the mainstream news, national news. But I think overall, we still need to work out what the funding models are. And then, of course, there's some people saying that some of the revenue from the platforms should be diverted to news organizations. The question then is, well, how? Split up in what way? You know, by the clicks on the sites, or by what model do you then say, okay, we'll take $1 billion each year from Facebook, we'll distribute it to US news organizations, but who gets the money? Which of them? You know, it's like royalty distributions for music, and they've never worked either.
Two more questions. Axel, I have a question related to Donald Trump. In your opinion, Donald Trump is bypassing media in the United States, but it's not only bypassing media, but he is also playing the role of gatewatcher and in some sense news curator. Yeah? Yes. There's a full industry behind all these politicians that are trying to do all the work that has been traditionally done by media. Do you consider that this could be a trend, considering also this wave of new populism all over the world that is trying to just bypassing and doing the same things that the media did in the past?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought of Donald Trump as a gatewatcher, but you're right, actually, because he is retweeting Fox News, and that's a very tight feedback loop between him and Fox News, actually, particularly, and some other conservative news sites. So from our perspective, yes, absolutely, he is. I mean, if as a Trump fan you were only following Donald Trump, you'd see a very different picture of the world than you would if you're consuming mainstream news more broadly. So from that perspective, yes, and yeah, if there are people who only follow Trump and only follow a small range of other far-right news, politicians or whatever, influencers, I guess, then yes, that enables and sustains populism, I guess. Yes, sure, absolutely. Having said that, and I've just written a book on filter bubbles and echo chambers, which is called Are Filter Bubbles Real? And the short answer is no, because there is practically no empirical evidence outside of very extreme groups that anyone who is using online media and social media is encapsulated and cut off from the rest of the world in a filter bubble, in an echo chamber. In fact, there's been studies in the US that the hardcore Trump supporters are also far more likely to read the New York Times and the Washington Post than ordinary Americans. The problem is not so much that the problem is not that they're not getting news from mainstream news sites. The problem is that when they get that news, they're reading it in an oppositional way inherently. They're hate reading it, basically. So these people, hardcore Trump supporters, they are following the New York Times, they're reading it very, very attentively in order to then debunk it and turn it on its head and be able to say, okay, New York Times reports that Trump had a contract with Putin, whatever, and then essentially the response will be on their own sites and in their own social media, well, look, the lefties are at it again, the deep state is at it again, they're continuing the conspiracy theory when in reality there's nothing to it. So they're particularly following those sites very closely. So they're not in a filter bubble, they're not in an echo chamber. And one of the arguments I make in that book is essentially to say, well, this whole argument that social media are responsible for populism, are responsible for Trump and others, is essentially a very simplistic form of technological determinism. A new medium comes along and suddenly society breaks down. It's never been that way. And in fact, the last time that people made that argument in the 30s and the 40s about radio, it wasn't that way either. The fascists didn't just come along because of a new medium. Mm-hmm. They certainly used that medium exceptionally well, exceptionally successfully, but they built on existing sentiment in a certain part of society and enabled that part of society made that part of society feel like they could now express those views publicly without repercussions, much as the neo-Nazis in the US are doing now. Suddenly it's okay not to be politically correct. Suddenly it's okay to hate black people and hate Jews and hate everyone else, hate women and whatever. So suddenly, they see certainly people like Trump and others in that circle that they use as role models for how they act. But it's not simply because social media has come along. It's not simply because Twitter, Trump uses Twitter or whatever. That's a part of the process, but it's not the cause of it, I think. So I'm very wary there of a really technologically determinist argument that says it's Twitter's fault that we have Trump. That's way too simplistic, I think.
I will have to rewrite my paper on that.
Right.
So any other question? No, I know it's... yeah?
Yep.
Karen?
So I work in communications. So I'm interested in how social has transformed the relationship between corporates and the media. So things like, media relations managers and using media distribution platforms like Meltwater and Icentia, things like that. Are these services and these roles, are these going to become redundant as journalists are being bypassed, and things like having personal relationships with journalists, etc. Is that all shifting?
Only to the extent that journalists aren't also influencers, I guess. So it's some journalists obviously will be very important still in getting the message out to an audience. But then there are other people who are also increasingly important. So I think, and ultimately, those sorts of social media tools will point you to the journalists who are in the right space for this, but they'll also point you to other influencers if the tools are good. So it's actually these large-scale social media analytics tools if they're building on the data, they won't actually know beforehand, is this a journalist or someone else who for some reason has become influential. So they'll point you to the right people, presumably for a particular message, for a particular context, whoever they are. That's what they should be doing. And if you target those people, then you'll still be able to get your message out quite effectively to a large audience. But increasingly, perhaps, the people that these tools identify will no longer be the journalists working in that field, but they might be bloggers or YouTubers or Instagram influencers or whatever they might be, or just people who happen to have a lot of followers within the right part of the network that talks about whatever it is that you want to talk about. That's I think the way this is going. We've done some work in Australia just on the Twitter sphere, just looking at the structure of the Australian Twitter sphere, and there we could see there are different clusters in the network who are focused on particular topics. So from that work, I could tell you who, if you want to get a story out about cycling, let's say, then these are the people who are at the core of the cycling cluster, or about parenting, or about whatever it might be. I could tell you these are the people who are in that cluster, who are the most important, the most followed, the most influential accounts ultimately in that cluster. And yeah, any commercial tool will be able to do the same and at a much bigger scale still, I think. So yeah, I think, again, it's a shift of balance. Previously, the journalists would be the bulk of these people, because they then are the ones who get it into the paper, into the morning TV shows, whatever it might be. Now that might have shrunk, and some other people might have come up to meet them there, I think. Does that make sense?
Okay, so thank you very much again, Axel. And remember that tomorrow, Axel, you can have a workshop with Axel from 10 to 1 p.m. Yeah. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks very much.